Now we're there.
Ah,
Now we are.
There you go. Let's
Okay.
see here.
I'm going to go away and let you talk.
Are you going to start video yourself, or?
It's me. Whoop, something else showed up.
Start.
Start video is in the lower left. There's mute and there you go. I got you. I see you. All
Okay.
good?
Good.
Okay. I'm going to mute your microphone a second, and so if you want to get my attention, there's also a chat. There's a little chat device there. Okay, so you can start typing at me if you need to get my attention. Okay, let me share a screen. Hello, everybody. I can't see anybody. I see the beautiful roof of the room you're in and all the great architectural design. And oh, there. Wait. We're starting to see. Well, it's still awful high. I still can't see you. Still can't see the group. There we go. People walking around. Oops. Now I see the ceiling. There we go. I see a couple of people. Very good. This is the annual discussion of kind of the state of the art of quantum computing at the moment. And for anybody who doesn't know me, nobody in this room doesn't know me, I don't think, but in case the video goes somewhere, I'm Jack War. I live in Colorado, and I used to write for Dr. Dobbs' Journal, and I started writing for Dr. Dobbs. Hello, Kevin. I started writing for Dr. Dobbs about quantum computing about 2006 or so, maybe 2008. And I'd been following it. I've been sort of interested since the 1990s, and then it seemed very far away and speculative, but over the years, as we have seen, it has progressed very rapidly. And this year, there were some excellent developments, and we will discuss them, and we will discuss what we might expect in the year 2020, aside from more foolishness from the media and Facebook and everything. But I mean, in terms of quantum computing, I'm going to share a desktop. Okay, this meeting is sponsored by Absolute Performance. They don't realize they're sponsoring it, but they are. And that's the company that I consult to, and they do an awful lot of stuff. They maintain networks and applications and everything in IBM I, and interesting company. Longest I've stayed with one company because there's no chronic underperformers there. It's a very pleasant place to work. Let's see here. Move to the next browser tab. Well, remember IBM Q Experience. IBM made public to the whole world their quantum devices, and they have put more and more of them online. And they have more that are more powerful that are not for the general public, but if you become a business partner with IBM, you can have access to the larger processors. They supposedly are up in the 70s now in terms of qubits, I have heard, though I'm not certain I'm correct on that. They certainly have a 53-bit processor, but I think they're up in the 70s now. And the stuff just changes so fast, even if the news is public, it's hard to keep track of it. When we first started talking about quantum computing some years ago in the fourth interest group, the information was hard to retrieve, and it was sparse. And now there's so much information out there on the web. If you start Googling quantum computing, there's not enough time in a year to look at everything there is on the web. Publicly announced, there are videos, training videos, there's access. We'll talk about that, access to other than IBM systems. But a good place to get started playing is to join the IBM Q experience and visit the composer and play with, dragging gates and dropping them and then measuring. It's all great fun. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. And you can run your circuits, you can save your changes. And run your circuits against a simulator or against a real processor. You could look at the results. It shows you what the original circuit diagram was and what it got turned into by the transpiler, which is the piece of the software that converts your high-level gates into the actual basis gates supported by the given processor you're on, and they're all different, or many of them are different. And you can see the CASM code for it, what it would be. This is the CASM code that's equivalent to the circuit diagram we were looking at a second ago. It says it's running now, our little meaningless circuit. And when it's completed, I'll go on to the next tab, and we'll come back to this in a second and see when it has been completed by the remote quantum processor. It's queued. It's what, when it says running, that may be a little optimistic. It may still actually be in the queue. This is the Qiskit software that you can have on your own computer, and it has a simulator, or you can connect using this software to the remote devices. You don't have to use the computer. You don't have to use the composer. You have to be a member of IBM Q, which is free, and there's basically no restrictions on it. People from all over the world are members of it, and you get a token, and then you use the token in your own Python code to connect to it and run jobs either on your local simulator, the simulator up in the cloud that IBM supports, or the quantum devices, or Qiskit is a pluggable framework, and other vendors are writing pluggable backends for Qiskit. So I use Qiskit to communicate. I use the Qiskit software to send my jobs sometimes to the simulators at simulators at Quantum Inspire, which is they're part of, they're sort of like vaguely related to the Microsoft effort to do quantum computing, and they have a supercomputer simulator, and I can run jobs using my same Qiskit code, but I can just direct them to the back end provided by Quantum Inspire, which is a mainframe simulator that's in Delft in the Netherlands. Or I can send it. Now, what I'm doing to I've got a little favorite program that I work on, and this allows me to send quantum programs. This is my quantum program runner, so I don't have, a lot of people, write the whole code for, loading the back end and sending the job every time they write a program, whereas I've got a piece of code that you just write your actual quantum program, and this will send it to the back end and bring you back a comma separated value file of your output, of your results. And right now, I am enhancing it. It supports several backends already, not just IBM, but now I'm enhancing it to support Rigetti, which is another vendor. Actually, Rigetti is a person. Let's go look at Rigetti here. This is Rigetti. This is another vendor. They're working on a quantum computer. Rigetti is a guy who worked at IBM, and he left IBM. As I understand the story, this is what I've been told. Rigetti left IBM and started his own company, and he's making processors that are similar to the ones that IBM's making. And they have a more closed world. You kind of have to, make a deal with them. I mean, they let people have free access, but it's limited and stuff, very limited and stuff like that. But they have written a simulator you can use on your local machine, and they do offer access via a Qiskit plugin. So my Qiskit code can send jobs to it. I just haven't published my code yet. Can send jobs to the Rigetti's online devices that they're doing with their business partners, or with random crazy people like myself who play with quantum computers. So that's the cool thing about Qiskit, is it's kind of become a universal framework for anyone who wants to make their devices or simulators available to the general public. All they have to do is write Qiskit backend, and everybody's playing with quantum computing at this point has figured out Qiskit and how to do the Python code. And it may not seem at first like, well, why don't they just provide a backend and everything like that? And the answer is Qiskit does more than just the basic levels of Qiskit. Qiskit Terra do a lot more than just prepare the job and ship it over the web or something like that. It actually quantum programs at this point, there's a lot of calculation that actually happens on the classical side, setting up the computation, and Qiskit does that. It has all the NumPy libraries imported into it, so it does an awful lot of linear algebra stuff before it sends the job actually to the remote computer. And so Qiskit is a very useful framework for preparing jobs. And furthermore, there's a standard, CASM2 standard it was built on. Originally, they envisioned this, QASM 2.0, which was partly a protocol for launching these jobs, but it's also a specification for how the backends describe themselves. And one of the most critical things that has to be done in the classical world still when you do a quantum computation is you use a lot of abstract gates that are defined in terms of matrix algebra. And then there has to be a transpiler step that turns your abstract high-level gates into the always very limited set of basis gates that are actually supported on the physical device you're talking to. And so Qiskit does all this. If a vendor whose front end to their back end, whose web application that supports their back end correctly implements the CASM2 protocol, which allows it to declare in JSON code what the configuration of the processor, including its basis gates. So what happens is, the Qiskit library, if you have a back end and you want to submit a computation to it, you submit your code to it, and then it goes out and it queries the back end and says, what basis gates do you support? And then it transpiles, as they call it, the code that the programmer wrote for the actual basis gates that are supported by the back end, because the back end is able to identify to Qiskit what the basis gates are that it supports in JSON. So Qiskit's a very, very useful tool, whether you are particularly committed to IBM's quantum computing model, or whether you want to explore every vendor's model if the vendor will let you have access, because they're all writing Qiskit. They're called providers. They're writing provider backends. And this year, I became a Qiskit advocate. That's a badge on one of these badge sites. This is part of the world of professional computing these days that I don't know if everybody has seen badges yet. So I explained that different companies, this is not just IBM, the badge company is actually a separate company. It's called Acclaim. And they provide certification. It's sort of like a certification authority, and they award badges. You can go look up people's badges on that, and it's a way of identifying constrained skill sets, so that somebody can say, well, I'm badged at this and badged at that, and it's not quite the same as like being a Microsoft certified blah blah blah. But companies can offer quick programs and say, if you pass, you pass the test, and then we'll certify you with this badge. And I got badged as a QuizKit advocate, which means that when I speak about, I've passed some tests, and it means that I can speak about QuizKit with a certain amount of insight and authority, though it does not mean that I speak for IBM in any way, shape, or form. It just means that I'm participating in their open source project, because QuizKit is open source, and that I've checked in a certain number of changes. I've checked in a lot of changes to the code, and not necessarily terribly significant ones, but I've certainly done my share of, sweeping up after the elephant. And I have passed a test, which the test was supposed to take 3 hours. It took me 3 weeks. It was a lot of linear algebra, but I sure know a lot more linear algebra than I knew when I came to visit you last year. I got to tell you that. That's been one of the big changes in my life, is that I finally learned linear algebra. I had some of the exposure to it in 11th grade, but that was the last time I had looked at linear algebra. And so now, and basically, as people say all sorts of things about quantum computing is this and quantum computing is that. It's really, really very simple, and this is what I've learned in the last year. Here's what quantum computing is. Let me see. I think I have excuse me. I think I have a presentation that I wrote for the people who do Golang, and they had a big confab here, and I wrote a thing about opportunities for Go in quantum computing. Basically, digital binary computing models our world in Boolean algebra. Everything, pictures, videos, as we all know, as all us fourthers know. There's nobody here in this room who does not know this. Quantum computing models the world in linear algebra. That's what quantum computing is. It's a linear algebraic model of the world. That's basically what it is. And it leverages certain rather unusual phenomena at the subatomic level that allow it to make some nice linear algebra calculations. That's what quantum computing is, when you get right down to it. It's a different way to model the world. It's, instead of being a matchstick, it's kind of a sphere, a block sphere. I wish to digress a moment and tell you a funny story about quantum computing. IBM's quantum computing is based on transmons. Transmons are sort of like anti-transistors. They are 2 layers of superconducting material separated by a layer of non-superconducting material. They're basically a voltage to frequency converter. If you change the voltage on one side, there's a wave on the other, and the frequency of it changes. That's a very simple explanation by a non-electrical engineer of what a transmon is. Microsoft became fascinated a decade ago with the possibility of using Majorana fermions, M-A-J-O-R-A-N-A, fermions, for quantum computing instead of using transmons, because Majorana fermions, you can manipulate them in a sort of glass that theoretically, they weren't even proven to exist until 2018. Microsoft went forward on the basis that they would be able to prove that these exist, and they put a lot of money into it. And they, a lot of the work's being done in Delft, in the Netherlands, and they went after this model of quantum computing. And the attraction of it is that it's more stable if it works. If it ever works, it's more stable it's going to be more stable than the supercooled transmons, and it will not happen at supercooled temperatures. It will happen at cold temperatures, but they're not supercool temperatures. So it's a very attractive model for them, and they're hoping to leapfrog the other players like Google and IBM that got into the field of building hardware before Microsoft did. And it's an interesting idea. And but the funny part of it is, I'm sure that there are people in this room that read Isaac Asimov's robot stories when they were young. Asimov started writing about robots in the 1940s, and he hypothesized that, he wrote about 1948, he started writing the stories, and that was about 13 years after the positron had been discovered. And he made his robots positronic. And the way that the robots worked is their brain was a platinum iridium sponge with etched pathways in it, which delineated their intelligence, and that their computation occurred by according to Asimov, by the creation and destruction of positrons along these pathways. Okay, so far so good. Nice science fiction, 1948. Here is a description from a modern article about how topological quantum computing is what I was describing to you about using Majorana fermions. Okay, this is how it works. The process of creating a particle-antiparticle pair, moving one of the particles around a torus, and annihilating it specifies a unitary operator on the ground state. In other words, they've invented positronic computing. I don't know if they're really positrons, but basically Asimov had an idea, and it actually turns out to be true. A lot of growing old is watching the lousy science fiction you read when you were a kid come true. So it seems to be coming true in the world of quantum computing, that topological quantum computing is basically very, very close to what Asimov conceived in 1948, and he called it positronic robots. Good heavens. Anyway, here's a paper on it. Like I said, there's infinite papers on it. This is a very good paper on topological quantum computation if you want to look at this. Friedman, Kitaev, Larson, and Wang. Okay, February 1st, 2008. This was the paper that launched 1,000 ships. In one of my old Dr. Dobbs articles, I interviewed Michael Hermele at the University of Colorado in the Gamow building, named after the famous scientist Gamow. And I interviewed him about topological quantum computing, and he tried to explain it to me, and it went right over my head at the time. But now I'm starting to understand what he was talking about 11 years later, 10 years later after I talked to him. A lot of this stuff is like that. Let's see. Go back a few. Okay, so one of the big stories of the year was that Google proclaimed quantum supremacy. Wahoo! Does that mean Google wins and everybody else loses? No, that's quantum supremacy is a term of art, and it's under severe attack on political grounds right now. Using that term, there is a large contingent in the science community, because science community now, especially quantum computing and physics and everything, is very, very international. And there is a feeling in the international science community that terms like quantum supremacy are reminiscent of colonialism. And the term quantum supremacy has been attacked. It sort of has been agreed to speak in terms of quantum advantage now. And what quantum supremacy / quantum advantage is roughly, is there an empirical proof that quantum computers, given advances in quantum computers and advances in conventional computers for the foreseeable future, for the unforeseeable future, is it provable, reasonably provable empirically, that quantum computing in certain computations will have an unbeatable advantage over classical computation? So NASA sort of accidentally published a paper before it was supposed to be published, and everybody grabbed it off the web real fast, myself included. And this was Google announcing that they had proven quantum supremacy, quantum advantage. And this is the paper, and you can find this all over the web now. It's been released since then. And what they basically did was they made, I'm going to explain this very colloquially and at my level of understanding, and not necessarily at the same level of understanding that a quantum physicist would have of it, or someone who really, really understood totally the mathematics of quantum computing. But basically, what they did is they created an abstract computation. It was not a computation that had any, what you would think of as useful output, but it did have output. And the output, furthermore, the output as the input values changed would make cute little patterns, interference patterns, with different runs of the same computation that were fairly categorizable so that they could be reasonably sure. So they were trying to create a computation that would take a very long time to run on a simulator. So they couldn't prove that it had run correctly on the quantum computer by running it on the simulator from their point of view. So they had to create a computation that whose output data was mathematically guaranteed to fall statistically into a certain kind of pattern. So they created such a computation, and they ran it on a quantum computer, and the computation completed in 200 seconds. And Google announced that to do this in a simulator would have taken 10,000 years. And they published their paper. Well, they were rather breathless, and Scott Aronson, who is a noted physicist and quantum computing authority, said that he wasn't sure about all the numbers, but he thought they had demonstrated quantum advantage. And that was like, you know, it wasn't exactly the Pope blessing it, but it was like a very, very senior cardinal blessing it. And he said, it's not jet travel between the continents, but it's like the Wright brothers flying at Kitty Hawk for 13 seconds, that he believed quantum advantage had been demonstrated. And no one that I know of totally disagrees with that, but IBM actually did some analysis of their numbers, and IBM said, no, it would not have taken 10,000 years to perform this calculation using classical computation. It would have taken about 2.5 days. But that's still a great number, you know. And they went on, and this is like, you know, I was using a Catholic metaphor a little while ago about the Pope and Cardinals. Well, they say, don't show off your Latin to a Jesuit, is another Catholic saying. Don't show off your Latin to a Jesuit. And what happened is that Google had was showing off their Latin to the Jesuits at IBM, and they sat there and dissected Google's description of how you would implement such a computation in classical terms, and they said, no, you can partition it much more efficiently than that. You don't have to run the thing straight through, and the key of it is tensor contraction deferral. And if you want the scoop on that, feel free to read the paper. This is, if you say IBM, if you Google something like IBM response quantum supremacy, this is that paper, leveraging secondary storage to simulate deep 54-qubit Sycamore circuits. That is their paper, and they sort of took a lot of the wind out of Google's sails, but not maliciously, because the devices that basically Google and IBM are using the same technology, and anything that's true about the Google devices is largely true about IBM's devices. They essentially work the same way. So if Google has demonstrated quantum supremacy for quantum advantage for transmon-based quantum computing, it applies to IBM's devices as well. But they just wanted to put their oar in and say, let's not overhype it, because that's been the curse of quantum computing for some time. And they talk about that. here are these patterns that I was talking about. These are the patterns. The characterization of the quantum devices. One of the things about the quantum devices, one of the reasons your code has to be transpiled, is that not everything that intersects two gates in your quantum computation is actually possible, and your computation sometimes has to shuffle quite a bit to make two abstract gates appear to interact using real gates, because they're not all connected to all. Not all qubits are connected to all the other qubits in the device. So you have to play a little bit of whisper down the lane, and bouncing back and forth to achieve your computation. And here was a new simulation strategy which Google had not considered, that led IBM to conclude that the computation would not actually take 10,000 years, take a couple of days. But still, a couple of days versus 200 seconds, that you can see that's a very compelling advantage in terms of chemistry and finance. And strangely enough, if you look at what's happening in Qiskit, as we have discussed before, I think Joe Latone discussed this when he was, I forget how far along this was, but where's my Qiskit? Qiskit, the main parts of it are Qiskit Terra, Qiskit Air, Qiskit Ignis, and Qiskit Aqua. And Qiskit Terra is the basic, set up and prepare your computation and transpile it. Qiskit Air is the simulator that runs on your local machine, and it's part of the simulation. Part of it is the simulation code that runs in the cloud when you run on IBM's simulator. Qiskit Ignis is the error correction. We are in the era of noisy intermediate stage quantum computing, so we have to do error correction. Ignis is the error correction toolkit. And then Aqua is the algorithms. Now they call the kinds of programs you write, they call them quantum assembly, but it isn't really quantum assembly. It's sort of like quantum microcode. And Aqua is the actual high-level algorithms that effectively are the assembly steps of some future higher-level quantum language, like quantum. There's a quantum algorithm called a variational quantum eigensolver, and at the top of this heap of code, there's Aqua code that takes parameters and runs a VQE, a variational quantum eigensolver. And really, basically, that's in the future of quantum computing, that'll be like an assembly operator, VQE, with a bunch of parameters to it. So they don't even. So we don't really know what the high-level language is going to look like, but there's people pretending to be writing very high-level languages in quantum computing, but they're all really down here at this microcode level. And Aqua is the closest thing to something like at the level of assembly code that I have seen so far. That's, and the algorithms are just emerging, because this is a case of build it and they will come. Nobody knows. We found the first bricks of the yellow brick road, and we're sure that the yellow brick road goes somewhere, but we don't know what the next bricks are. And people are discovering this all the time. They're inventing their own ways to use this, excuse me, these mechanical devices and the simulations thereof, which is much easier to test most of the time, unless you have something very long. I've been running simulations for a friend that I ran one on a 16-core Xeon machine that took 13 days to complete. People are designing these algorithms as we speak, and as these algorithms are completed, they basically will be the assembly code underlying some future quantum language. So when you see certain people who shall remain nameless have made claims to be inventing the first quantum language, but what they're really doing is Microsoft came up with this claim that they were inventing the first quantum language. What they've really done is cast essentially what people are doing in Qiskit Aqua. They've written it so it looks like C#, So it's the same. We're all at the same level here. Nobody has gotten, nobody at least who has publicly spoken has gotten past this level that we are basically designing right now the operators that will become effectively the assembly language of future quantum computing. So that's where it is mathematically right now, so to speak. In terms of hardware, there's all kinds of stuff floating around. We mentioned Rigetti, and Rigetti, again, they're transmon based, and they have some different approaches. Rigetti felt he could go further if he flew the coop at IBM and started his own company. D-Wave is still around. We talked about D-Wave in 2014. They've been around for a long time, and again, they are still in the quantum annealing business, and I don't believe they are in the full so-called quantum Turing machine world, which is kind of where IBM and the others are, trying to make a fully featured quantum computer that implements all plausible gates, that has enough basis gates that can operate all plausible gates. What D-Wave has is a device that doesn't do all that, but has an awful lot more field history than what is being designed at the moment by IBM and Google and Microsoft, who Microsoft essentially just has their at the moment their simulators, because they have not shown publicly a device that actually works based on their topological quantum computing approach. Though I believe they will. I believe that they and others will come up with topological quantum devices, and that's one of the first things I want to say that we might see in 2020 is that this other kind of quantum computing that has never been seen yet might actually emerge, topological quantum computing. Xanadu, this is very interesting. The first thing I asked when I got involved in this stuff back in the previous decade was, why are we playing with electrical devices? Why don't we do it with light? I mean, light follows the quantum math of these interactions of it applies to light as well as it applies to electricity, and light is cool. I mean, everybody loves a laser. So why, Xanadu is trying to do photonic quantum computing, and I have not seen their devices, nor except in pictures on this website, and I have not totally grasped it, nor have I managed to get access to anything like it, though as I plow through more quantum computing resources than I can shake a stick at anymore, whereas it was hard to find any 10 years ago, but now there's more than I can keep track of. I hope to look at this, at photonic quantum computing, and they photonics. Instead of using electrons to carry information or perform calculations, we use photons. Unlike electrons, photons are very stable and almost unaffected by random noise from heat. So they say we use photonic chips to generate, control, and measure photons. Okay, I'd love to see it. Possibly I'll get access to this in 2020. I'd like to see photonic quantum computing, because that was the first question I asked back in the days of ion traps when I first saw them at NIST. Why don't you use photons? Why are you playing with ions? Well, the funny thing is that ion traps are still around, and there's a company called IonQ. And IonQ is an trapped ion quantum computer. So they're doing it, bouncing, I don't know, ions of what around. I have not had time to request access. I'm just basically at the moment, plowing my way through this and adding in the order that they're supporting themselves to QuizKit. So I don't know where ion traps have gotten to in the last 10 years. It's been 10 years since I saw one. They may be quite a ways ahead. They're making wild claims here. The world's most advanced quantum computer. I doubt that's true, but that's just, epistemological. It's not because I actually know anything. It's just when I hear stuff like that, I know that they've got a marketing department, but it doesn't tell me anything scientific. So this is very interesting, and I'm going to try to talk to them in 2020 and figure out how, I'm going to request access. I'm going to click this button sooner or later. I think I already have, and I don't think I ever heard back from them, but we'll see. Here's Quantum Inspire. I run things on their simulator. Quest, a quantum exact simulation toolkit. They are the whole question of simulation. One of the things that is crazy making in working on QuizKit code is that the mathematical libraries that are used in quantum simulation are not all ideally designed for that. Some of them are more aware of their use as front end as part of quantum computing simulation than others are, but there are libraries that are not so easy to use that way. That they're necessary because you don't, the same algorithms that were, some of the stuff that's floating around is still in Fortran. Some of these, Python libraries, really, they have backends that are written in Fortran, and as you install them using Python pip, it actually goes and uses GNU Fortran to compile these Fortran code, because some of these algorithms have never been, nobody's ever gotten around to rewriting them in C. Rewrite. It's not so much rewriting them; it's rewriting them, proving them, and testing them, and getting them accepted by the whole industry. So there's a movement now in the mathematics/physics community to write better and better math libraries that are more and more tuned to the needs of quantum computing simulation. This is one of them, and it's not the only one. So this is all happening right now. This is kind of interesting. Anyway, if you want to really get a funny introduction to if we've talked about this, and like me, at first the interest was really that they were playing with devices and playing with physics, and you really want to get a picture of quantum computing and get a nice laugh at the expense of the sensationalizers. Scott Aronson, the physicist who I mentioned to you before, is a friend of Zach Weinersmith, who writes the web comic Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. And Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, about a year ago, published a cartoon written in part by Scott Aronson and illustrated by Zach Weinersmith called The Talk, in which a mother walks into a room and finds her son reading a sensationalist magazine about quantum computing. And the joke is, it's as if she came in and found him reading a girly magazine, and they have the talk, except it's not about sex, it's about quantum computing. But it's cast very much like a discussion between a mother and a son, where she found him reading a dirty magazine and she's teaching him about sex. So it's hysterical cartoon, but it's written by one of the best physicists in the field. So it's worth reading. It's called The Talk. And if you do Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, The Talk, you will find it, do this so you can see the URL if you're curious. Yeah. It's just smbccomics.com, comic The Talk 3. Oops. And that's the URL for it. And it's a very, very funny and very useful desensationalizer of quantum computing. And explanation of why at the root, why the algorithms work at all. It's a better explanation in this comic than I've given you in the last 10 years of talking to you about quantum computing. So so the last thing I'd like to address is what you're likely to see what I think we're all likely to see in 2020. And I think I'm going to spew industry rumor here fairly indiscriminately, and I don't want to be held to any of this, but as far as what I understand is that we're going to see more devices from more companies coming out. I have heard rumors that Microsoft is going to put online a quantum device, but it may not be at first their holy grail topological quantum computing device. They may actually build some transmon-based devices at first, so they can get a little further along and have a little more credibility in the field, because they want to have some working hardware rather than just a simulator for people to go to. Because you know, a poorly working quantum processor is more fun than the best simulator in the world. Let's face it. It's got nerd appeal, and the whole battle now in quantum computing is in advance of in commercial quantum computing. The whole battle is in advance of the general availability of these devices. Who gets the mind share? Because when they suddenly are available, people are, the history of computing tells us that people are going to buy based on which devices they can hire people to operate. So if you have people trained on your devices and then finally the darn things work reliably enough that you can sell them for real, and you have a 2/3 share, everybody has them at the same time, but you've got a 2/3 share of the programmer community, you win. So that is what the battle in commercial quantum computing is right now. It probably bears mentioning that this also, it's not just a battle between commercial companies in the United States. This is an international competition, and not all the people in other countries who are studying this will necessarily share with us if they get there ahead of us to the same degree we have shared with them. So it's very interesting for people to be involved, just because we want to keep our own mind share. We want to be able to have the same toys everybody else has, and if we want to have them, we're going to have to make sure that we build them ourselves here in the Western world. So it's a very interesting competition. So Google and IBM are certainly going to publicly announce larger devices. There will probably be, 128 qubit devices appearing in 2020, based on the current technology, and the excuse me, the reliability of these devices is increasing all the time. There is a lot of doubt in the technologically whether the current architecture will get us all the way to the Emerald City. That some big sea change like topological quantum computing may be required, or photonic quantum computing, or ion trap. Maybe transmons don't get us there. Maybe this is just an intermediate stage of engineering that we go through so that we could prove to ourselves that this is going to work for real, because they were easier to build than some of the more exotic stuff that people are working on now. But the more exotic stuff may be what actually wins the battle to excuse me, to final delivery of a generally available device that is reliable enough that it can be used in business and in finance and in medicine and and in defense. So but we'll definitely see more announcements, and we will see more larger devices based on current architectures, and we may see some surprising announcements of these devices like photonic and ion trap and topological quantum computing that are currently under wraps, but they may actually make breakthroughs in 2020. And it's to be anticipated that they will, because if they don't, this work is so expensive that it's not going to be sustainable. It's one thing for Google and several other companies and IBM and the Martinez Group at University of California, San Diego, to be working on one architecture together and splitting the cost, and and basically sharing each other's intellectual property to advance the field. It's another thing for individual companies like Xanadu in Toronto, or Microsoft in Redmond to be financing a whole new branch of quantum computing all entirely on their own. So you can expect some announcements because they, the shareholders at a certain point are going to want some return on their money, or there's some kind of vouchsafe that they're going to get a return on their money. So that all said, I'm just plowing through it and trying to understand this stuff. After 20 years of looking at it, I've got a worm's eye view of the industry, and I've shared that worm's eye view with you. And thank you very much for listening to me. And if there's any questions, I'll turn the microphone back on and somebody can come up close to the computer so I can hear you, or you can type in questions to the chat feature of Zoom. And thank you very much for listening.
Oh, what do we want to do?
Turn the mic
Well, Jeff's going to turn the mic on.
I've turned the mic on. I can hear you guys talking, but not very well. You got to come close.
Okay. All right. Did you turn us back on again?
You're on. I can hear you.
Okay.
All right. We were heckling all during your show. You got a lot of applause at the end. People who weren't even here actually applauded. It was impressive. I think it had something to do with quantum entanglement or too many cookies at break time.
Too many dead cats in the box.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of Heisenberg humor. Where to find it? Well, I'm not certain. Thank you so much, and we're really hoping that we can post this as a YouTube video.
I have a question.
Well, by all means.
Okay, I got a question for you.
Sure.
So I work for a company called Made in Space, and we're designing robotic automated spacecraft to go into space. And the idea is our first unit is going to be called Argonaut 1 if you go on YouTube. And it's going to create about 5 to 8 kilowatts of solar power on this small spacecraft, autonomous spacecraft. So when you're talking about quantum needing to run it really cold, maybe a future mission would be put a quantum computer on one of our systems that would generate the electrical power that you need. And you could have a quantum computer in Earth's orbit at, minus 200 degrees, whatever it's naturally cold out there. So what do you think about that?
Well, in the current state of transmon-based quantum computing, of which I have a layman's knowledge and no more, I do know that the temperatures that near space is about twice as warm as they need for quantum computing. You're talking about the kind of temperatures that are not found outside the Oort cloud. We're talking about fractions of degrees Kelvin above absolute zero is where they're at right now. And
well, of course, with 5 to 7 kilowatts, you could power a cooling unit that takes you the rest of the way.
Absolutely. It sounds very plausible, and it's funny. I wouldn't be surprised if people are already doing it.